Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. What a beautiful day we have. It's that time of year. It's fall. It's time for the oysters. The local oyster beds were opened on Wednesday. So we have the first oysters of the season today. The interesting thing is they only open this season now for tonging. I don't know if you all know what tonging is. I don't know if you've seen pictures of the tongs on the video today, but it's a handcrafted tradition that takes a lot of hard work and a very strong back. They're 10-foot poles that are connected at the bottom, very similar to a pole digger. And they have rakes on both sides. And what they do is they'll go down into the sand or into the mud, and they'll open these up, and the rakes will come together, and they'll pick up the oysters, and they'll pick them up, and they'll take them, and they'll drop them onto the boat. So that's what they're allowed to do now. And this is controlling the harvest of the oysters in the proper way in order to keep them thriving in the natural environment. These are wild oysters that we're using today. They're coming from an area south of us, about 60 miles from the Pamlico Sound, just south of Englehart, in the waters of the Sound, where the river meets the Sound, which determines the flavor of the oyster. What's interesting is oysters are as unique to their environment as any food that you'll eat. Whether they're in a muddy bottom, whether they're in a sandy bottom, whether they're from the ocean side, whether they're from the bay side, whether they're from the Sound side, wherever these oysters thrive, wherever their environment specific to that micro region, the temperature of the water, the salinity of the water, all plays a part in the flavor of the oyster. The oyster is a filter for our waterways. A single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. There is small algae, and the salt salinity of the water determines the flavor of that oyster. Wild oyster takes about 3 years to reach maturity. A cultivated oyster, which is grown from hatcheries with seeds, takes about half that time. So together we have the wild oyster and we have the cultivated oyster that we're trying to use to help supply us with these wonderful bivalves, as we call them, that we know as the oyster. We all probably grew up with oyster stew. We probably grew up eating raw shucked oysters. For those of you that enjoy a shucked oyster on the half shell, there's nothing better. You probably get to know the type of oyster that you like best, whether it's a bay oyster or a Sound oyster or maybe a more salty ocean oyster. Each person has their own preference. Probably the oyster that you grew up with in the neighborhood with which it was grown is the oyster that you like best. The oyster stew is a cooked oyster, obviously. And even if you're not a huge fan of oysters themselves, because they have a very unique texture, we know this, they say that the oyster that you eat takes about 5 to 8 chews in order to release all their flavor, so that you can appreciate exactly what makes that oyster unique and special. A lot of us just swallow them whole because that texture is not necessarily either familiar or comfortable with everybody. So when we cook the oyster, it's going to plump and firm itself up, obviously. And that gives it a different texture, maybe one that's a little bit more palatable for some than others. But what it does is it releases this incredible juice, or as we know, as the liquor. When we speak of oyster juice, we speak of the liquor, which is the liquid that the oyster keeps in the shell during its filtering process. And that unique flavor is as special as the oyster itself. So when you enjoy an oyster stew, but not really care for the texture of the oyster, it's the broth that makes it so delicious. And you can leave the oyster in the bottom of the bowl and just drink the broth because it's so fabulous. Traditionally, oyster stew was made with milk and oysters. That was it. And because you have to be very careful when you simmer oysters in milk because the milk will curdle, the recipe that you have in front of you today will be done a little differently. This is to allow it to reach a simmer without the cream breaking. But traditionally it was milk, a touch of butter, maybe some salt and pepper, possibly an oyster cracker or a biscuit or some cornbread, and that was it. Today we expect a little bit more, maybe, from these guys that wear these funny jackets and all this new love for food and making it a little bit more unique and personal. So I'm going to do that a little bit today with our version of oyster stew. We're going to put bacon in it. Of course, for those that grew up with oysters, you probably grew up with bacon as well, or some sort of salt pork. So it's a kind of a natural combination that we put the two together. If someone does not care for bacon, when we do our portions back here, we bring them out to you all, just let them know, and we'll try to make sure we get you one without the bacon in it. It's easy enough to do. You don't have to put bacon in it, but we do. We're going to put some herbs in there. I just feel like it adds a little freshness and brightness, not only for the presentation of the oyster stew, but for the flavor of it. A little bit more depth. I like to use light herbs in this broth, so we'll use dill and chive, tarragon, parsley. Herbs like rosemary, sage, oregano, I would probably save from a more savory, heavier dish. Worcestershire and Tabasco will be the base of the flavor in the broth. This will add a little bit of backbone to that cream without hopefully adding any heat or any overly salty component. But again, those add a little bit of unique complexity to the dish. And we'll obviously salt it. I just use Outer Banks sea salt, by the way. If you haven't found it yet, look for it. It's Atlantic seawater that's been dehydrated and then left to air dry in the sun, and so look for the Outer Banks sea salt to use in your cooking. So I hope everybody's got a recipe in front of them. The optional ingredients in this recipe right now are some vegetables, a simple julienne of carrots, celery, and fennel. The demo today will not have those vegetables in it, but I wanted to let you know there's so many ways to add body and texture to an oyster stew. The vegetables are one component. You could add grits. You could add mashed potatoes. You could float your piece of cornbread right in the bowl, so you've got some texture as well. So, as we start to pass this around, let's get cooking. So, I'm going to start with the oysters. We've got our pot nice and hot. We've got our bacon chopped up. I think the smokier the bacon, the better, just because it's what it's there for, is add that little extra flavor. So we're going to add some already cooked chopped bacon. And then we're going to bring this up, obviously over medium-high heat. To that, I've got half and heavy cream. Again, heavy cream can thicken very quickly. very rich, 40% butter fat. So in order to keep it from being too rich and being too heavy, we've cut it with half and half. And again, this will allow it to have some body, but won't break when we bring it up to the full simmer.
Do we have any questions for Sam at this point?
I did. And because the oysters, let's talk about this quickly. You can shuck your own oysters from the shell into a container, making sure, you make sure there's no shell left in it, and take all that liquor with you. You can buy these in a gallon, you can buy these in a quart jar with the liquor already in them. So with the liquid in the oyster together, there's no need to add more fat to it to get them started. They're going to begin to poach quickly in their own liquor. As we bring this up, we're just going to stir it gently, obviously. The recipe calls for Tabasco and Worcestershire. And again, you don't have to put either one of these in it if these don't float your boat. A little salt, maybe a little fresh cracked pepper would be all that you need. But we'll just measure a little bit of Tabasco, a little bit of Worcestershire. And all this does, it just gives a little character to that cream. Just takes a little of the richness away, adds a little bit of heat, lightly, just a tickle. And Worcestershire just adds that little unique, what we call umami today. I don't know if you all understand what that word is. It's just this flavor that's hard to describe. They say that we've created a sixth sense of taste, and that is called umami. Very often comes from anchovies. If anybody is international chef or cook at home that does Vietnamese or Thai cooking, the fish sauce is their version of Worcestershire. And this is an anchovy base, so that adds that unique flavor to it. So we've added just a little bit. You don't want that to be the primary flavor. So at this point, what you do, remember, whenever you cook, is taste your food. It's the first rule of cooking is always taste what you're making. It's like a painter cooking with his eyes closed. You have to taste your food. It needs salt. Now salt, I've got a strong opinion on salt. Chefs use too much of it. It's our crutch. We put it in everything. And it's one of those flavors that you can't quantify. It's supposed to make food taste better without tasting salty. Well, it's too easy to make it salty if you're not careful. So the recipes, and I probably did it here, it says salt to taste. Now, use your measuring spoon and measure it and get to know your salt tolerance, because everybody's level is different. Probably the biggest variable in a restaurant kitchen is that each chef has their certain level of salt tolerance and expectation. Some chefs like a lot of salt, think that's right. Other chefs like this amount of salt. So we work really hard to teach each other to have a common ground of this is where our seasoning is. And it's hard to quantify without measuring it. And yet chefs say, let's just put a pinch in. So when you learn cooking with salt, don't hesitate to measure it and get to know what you think is best for you. That way, if you want to write your own recipe, you've measured it ahead of time. So I'm going to put about a half a teaspoon of salt in here. Yes, you can see what's going on. We're just getting these up to the simmer. You can feel the steam and see the steam on the broth, but it hasn't boiled. It hasn't come to the simmer yet. When cooking these oysters, the real key is not to boil them. You just want to cook them for 2 or 3 minutes so they get a little plump. And at that point, they're going to be done. So I'm going to taste one more time. And I'm going to go with another quarter teaspoon, so I put 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt in this batch. Then I've got my herbs. I've gone ahead and chopped these ahead of time for us. And again, I've got tarragon, chives, and dill. So here we are. It's just reached the simmer, and I'm done. And obviously, I've been talking through this whole process. I could have easily have cooked this in about half the time. So that's a wonderful thing about the oyster stew, is it takes really no time to cook. You know, I have the half and half, of course, in the heavy cream already measured out. Tabasco and Worcestershire, you've got these in your pantry. I know you do. Everybody's got it. So basically, it's a little bacon and a little herb and a quart of oysters, and you've got dinner. So what we're going to do is I'm gonna make a few of these so you can taste this recipe, at least hopefully get a pretty good idea what it's going to taste like.
What's the verdict on the oyster stew, gang?